Okay, it's 9 o'clock in Canada, I shouldn't say in Canada, in the East Coast, and 8 p.m. in Houston, Texas, where Rabbi Barry Gelman is, and it's a pleasure to welcome him. Rabbi Gelman is the rabbi of United Orthodox Synagogue in Houston, the largest synagogue in the Southwest. Rabbi Gelman served as the rabbi of Shar Shemaim congregation in Montreal, Canada. Before going to Houston, he also was the assistant rabbi at KJ in Manhattan and the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. Has a very impressive resume and involved in many communal activities in Houston and it's a pleasure to welcome him. And of course, I have an extra affinity because he's a redhead. I don't know how much it comes up, but of course that's...
whatever's left of it is red and red.
Yes. Okay. Rabbi Gelman, Vakasha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to welcome you,
Rabbi Gelman. And this is just a great honor and great joy for me to teach today for the Torah in Motion audience. I've always been a fan of Torah in Motion. I've learned from Torah in Motion, and I've followed developments. I've been jealous of the trips. Gabi and I still talk about one day trying to come on a Torah in Motion trip. So it's a great thing that you're doing, Rabbi Gelman. I don't know how many years already. Over 20 years?
Just about 20 years. Maybe it's hard to know exactly when we started. I was starting to do when we transitioned. Yeah, but it's 18, 19 years. Yeah, thank you.
You have really harnessed technology, and I don't know how many thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people have learned more Torah because of you and your staff and your donors and your supporters. So it's really wonderful for me to participate. I'm grateful for this opportunity. I want to welcome my mother-in-law, who I'm pretty sure is on this call, Rosemary, her screen. Gabi's on this call too, but I really want to thank Rosemary because I think that she took out some paid advertising in places for this class. So nice to have you on, Mom, as well as all of your friends. I'm going to share my screen just one moment. As soon as I have it set, excuse me. Okay, here we go. Okay, so today's topic this is a Parsha Hashavua Shiur. We're not going to be doing Parshanut tonight. We are going to be discussing a mitzvah in the Torah. I've recently switched from Parshanut Shiur here in Houston to something I'm calling the mitzvah Shiur, to take another mitzvah from the Parsha or a mitzvah related to the Parsha and to discuss it. In terms of questions, if there's something pressing, feel free to use the chat if you need to. Put questions in the chat. I'll try to get to them. If I can't get them into the middle, I'll get to them at the end. Okay, let's jump right in. In this week's Parsha, we have the obligation. The Torah teaches us the obligation when Bnei Yisrael enter into Eretz Yisrael to destroy all remnants of Avodah Zarah that are there. And this is in source number 1 from Devarim Perek Yudbet. Ela hachukim v'mishpatim asher tishmun lasot. Moshe tells Bnei Yisrael that when you get into the land that God gave you, Pasuk Bet, verse 2, Abeid te'abedun et kol hamikamot asher avdu sham hagoyim. You must destroy all the sites at which the nations you are to dispossess worship their gods. And the Torah goes on to describe all the types of things, whether they are on lofty mountains or on hills or any under tree. V'nitatztem et mizbechotam v'shibartem et matzevotam v'asherehem tisrafun ba'esh. You have to tear down their altars and smash their pillars and their posts and burn it in fire. You have to do all of that. It's an all-out war against Avodah Zarah. But then, at the end of this section, the Torah says, Lo ta'asun kain la'Hashem Elokechem. You shall not do this to Hashem your God. Meaning all of the things that I told you that you have to do with regards to Avodah Zarah, with regards to idolatry and aspects of idol worship, of idolatry, You have to destroy. You don't do any of that to anything that has to do with God. Lo ta'asum kein l'Hashem Elokeichem. That's the mitzvah we're going to focus on today. And this is the pasuk that is going to cause us to have to investigate this really interesting question about someone who has a tattoo of God's name and wants to erase it. Now, you may be wondering, why would someone have a tattoo of God's name? That's a good question. We're going to get there. Patience, and we're going to get to that question of why it would be that someone would have a tattoo of God's name. But first, we have to understand this mitzvah, this prohibition first. This is mentioned in the Mishnah Torah. I'm sorry, in the Sefer HaMitzvot, it's labeled wrong. The Sefer HaMitzvot, not the Mishnah Torah, where the Rambam, in mitzvah number 65, the Rambam says, Shelo la'abed beit HaMikdash, o batei knesiyot, o batei midrashot, that we are not allowed to destroy the sanctuary, synagogue, houses of study. V'chein ein mochkin et hashemot hamukdashim, this is our key, nor may we erase any holy names. We'll have to see what that means. Ve'ein ma'abidin kitvei HaKodesh, and we're not allowed to destroy holy books. Shene'emar, abed ta'abdun, and now the Rambam quotes our pasuk. We are certainly to destroy all of those things related to Avodah Zarah. Lo ta'asun kein l'Hashem Elokeichem. However, we are not allowed to do these things to the Lord your God. Meaning, again, now the Rambam fleshes out what that pasuk means. What does it mean not to destroy anything related to God? Shuls, obviously the Beit HaMikdash, Batei Midrashot, God's name, or holy books. The Sefer HaChinuch, following in the footsteps of the Rambam, as he often does, lays it out similarly the same way. Shelo la'abed divarim shenikra shemo yiparach aleihem, not to destroy things upon which his holy name is called. Shelo na'abed v'nimche hadivarim shesham hakadosh baruch hu nikra aleihem. That we are not to destroy and erase the things upon which the holy name is. And he gives examples, same examples as the Rambam. Beit HaMikdash, v'sifrei HaKodesh, u'shmotav ha'yikarim baruch hu, the temple, holy books, and God's precious name. V'al kol zeh ne'emar, quoting the same psukim, lo tasun kein l'Hashem Elokeichem. One is not allowed to do this to God, all those things that we are told to do upon entering into Eretz Yisrael regarding the remnants of Avodah Zarah. And then the Sefer HaChinuch talks about the punishment. It's the punishment for this. He quotes the Gemara in Masechet Makot. We're not going to deal with the punishment too much, just to understand that this is the way that this pasuk is understood. So that's point number one. The pasuk tells us, don't do that to God. The Rambam and the Sefer HaChinuch help us understand what that mitzvah means. We're not allowed to destroy anything related to God's name. For our purposes, we are talking about God's actual name that's been written somewhere. What does that mean, God's name? Right? What names of God are we not allowed to destroy? There are many names of God. Shalom, sometimes God is one of the names of God. What are we not allowed to erase? So the Gemara in Masechet Shavuot and a few other sources after help us with that. The Gemara says, Yesh Shemot Shenimchakim, Yesh Shemot She'ein Nimchakim. This is source number 5. There are some names which we are allowed to destroy, and some names which we are not allowed to destroy, not allowed to erase. Elu hein Shemot She'ein Nimchakim. These are the names of God that we are not permitted to erase. And the Gemara elaborates on them. Kigon, for example, El, Elohecha, Elohim, Elohechem, Eheyeh, Asher Eheyeh, and the name is spelled Aleph, Dalet, Yud, Hey, Shaddai, Sivaot, Hare Elu, Ein Nimchakim. We are not allowed to erase these names. Now, at least we have a list of the names that we are not allowed to erase. Any other name that refers to God is not included, at least in this biblical prohibition of erasing God's name. This is just an interesting point. Shaddai is one of the words names of God that we're not allowed to erase. There's a well-known sort of rabbinic encyclopedia called the Stei Chemed. I'm sure Rabbi Gelman's either has it behind him on a shelf, right? Mine's just on the other side of the wall. In one of the introductions of one of the volumes, he defends naming the book Sidei Chemed against people who took him to task because they thought it would be pronounced Shaddai Chemed, and that would be disrespectful to the name, and people may erase it and may be thrown out. So he has to go out of his way to explain why it was okay for him to name his book Sidei Chemed. I saw that in a tshuva, I think, of Rav Asher Weiss. Okay, so these are the names you're not allowed to erase. Just an interesting machloket between the Sefer HaChinuch and the Rambam as to exactly what those 7 names are. The Sefer HaChinuch lists them in our mitzvah number 437 in the top 613 mitzvot. The Rambam, the Sefer HaChinuch lists them. I have them here, colorized for you. One is the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey. Sheyikruo to Chachamim Shem HaMeforash, we call the Shem HaMeforash. And Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud. We said it already. And Kel, Elokah, Elokim, Shakai, Tzevaot. Those are the 7, right? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are the 7 names, according to the Sefer HaChinuch, that we are not allowed to erase. Erasing God from the Sota ceremony. Excellent. The Gemara talks about that in the chat. That is someone whose name is iPad. That's a great question, iPad. And the answer is, the Gemara says, in order to bring shalom between a husband and a wife, even God's name can be erased. Excellent, excellent question. I should put that in my source sheet for next time. I hadn't thought about that. Thank you so much. So this is the Rambam's formulation of the 7 names. I'm sorry, the Sefer HaChinuch's formulation of the 7 names. The Rambam, interestingly, has a different list. The Rambam says Yud, Hey, and Vav, Hey, for sure, and says, O Hanichtav Adonai, meaning Rambam says the Yud, the Hey, and the Vav, and the Hey, and the Aleph, and the Dal, and the Nun, and the Yud, that's one name, because they're both pronounced the same way. Since we pronounce them the same way, that's one name, so that's 1. So he has to add in 1, because now he's down 1 from the list of the Sefer HaChinuch. So he says, Kel, Elokah, Elokim, and he adds Eheyeh, right? The name that God told Moshe to tell Bnei Yisrael was God's name when God said, who's sending me? Who should I tell him sent me? And God says, Eheyeh. And if you remember back, the Gemara, Masechet Shavuot, also listed Eheyeh. Unclear to me why the Sefer HaChinuch would not include Eheyeh if it's explicit in the Gemara that it is included. Nonetheless, the Rambam does include it, as well as Shakai and Tzivakot, and those are the 7 names of God, and this machloket on the one word between the Rambam and the Sefer HaChinuch. Often the Sefer HaChinuch just follows in lockstep with the Rambam, but here there's a difference between them. Okay. So now that we understand, the pasuk means we're not allowed to destroy God's name. And now we understand which of God's names are included in this prohibition. Now let's get to the question. This question was sent to more than one posek. I studied, for the purposes of this class, a tshuva from Rav Asher Weiss, who's a contemporary posek, incredibly popular, has 3 volumes of Shelot Tshuvot and volumes on Chumash, and sends out weekly stuff. And he's been a huge source of halachic guidance during the corona pandemic, Rav Asher Weiss. And a question was also sent to Rav Eliyahu Bakshi Daron, who served as the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel between 1993 and 2003. And you see that Rav Bakshi Daron only recently died, April 12th, and he actually died, Rahman al-Itzlan, from the coronavirus. He was sent this to me, it's a gut-wrenching question, because I maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I hear in the way that Rav Bakshi Daron rephrases the question, the angst of this poor woman who now has God's name tattooed on her ankle because of this very, very sad situation. So I'm going to read the question, and then we'll try to understand how Rav Bakshi Daron, as well as Rav Asher Weiss, go ahead and answer the question. Their answers are very similar. They touch on a bunch of similar approaches to get to their final answer. So here's the question. It starts where the arrow is. Bigil Tzair Tachat Hashpa'at Adam Mivugar Asiti Kitovet Ka'aka. That's the Hebrew term for a tattoo. Al Kiboret Zeroa Yamin. I had a tattoo on my right ankle. And listen to this. Uba HaPasuk Misefer Vayikra. What did she have tattooed on her ankle? A pasuk from the book of Vayikra. V'seret lanefesh lo titnu b'bsarechem v'ketuvet ka'aka lo titnu bachem ani Hashem. The very pasuk, not the pasuk that we studied, but another pasuk in the Torah that says you are not allowed to have a tattoo. That's the pasuk she had tattooed on her ankle. Right? Talk about like being a dafkanik. Chutzpah, right? The very pasuk in the Torah that tells us about this isur, about this prohibition, that's what she tattooed. But we'll learn that maybe it's not as bad as it sounds. Hadavar na'aseh b'hashpa'at adam mikat misuyemet shekshura l'kabbalah. She says this was done under the influence of a cult leader that had something to do with Kabbalah. So she was in a cult in Israel. There are cults in Israel. There's a wonderful show in Israel, by the way, called Slicha al HaShe'ilah. You can see some of them on YouTube. It's a fascinating show. It's based on an Australian show called You Can't Ask This, which is essentially, they get people who have gone through very strange or have very interesting and sometimes very sad life experiences, and they put them in front of a blank screen, and they answer random questions from people. Some of it's heart-wrenching, really fascinating. And one of the episodes of Slicha al Sheila is a group, they're interviewing people who got out of cults in Israel. And so we may not know that there are cults in Israel. There are cults in Israel. Unfortunately, the cults in Israel often sort of hide under the guise of religion, but they're actually cults. So she was in a cult that was had some Kabbalistic undertones. V'hu be'etzem hishtamesh bi k'dei l'rot im yikareh li mashehu im me'eseh et k'tuvat hakaka. She says, this man used me and sort of convinced me to have this tattoo to see if anything would happen to me, maybe some punishment from God, if anything would happen to me if I would get this tattoo. So you could just hear in the question the very, very sad, tragic circumstances under which this woman got God's name tattooed on her ankle. And then she goes on to say that I am no longer an anti-religious person. She says it here. Eini ma'amina b'dafka hazeh be'anti. I don't believe anymore in being, purposely and so specifically anti-religious. Hanora'i hazeh kalpe hadat. It doesn't necessarily understand that she's a religious person, but she's no longer purposely antagonistic to religion. So it bothers her. And then it also bothers her, she says, I have a son, and my son asks me about it, and that bothers me. And so she wants to remove this tattoo. But she says, Lachein, ani me'unyenet lahasir ota. I want to remove this tattoo. Yesh nituche laser shebehem nitan lahasir ketovet kaka. There are laser, that's how it's removed these days, and you could take off the tattoo. Ulam hapam ani rotzel hadavar yaseh nachon v'shelo eseh chet nosaf basarat hakapua. But I don't want to do anything before I ask a rabbi, because I don't want to do another sin. I did something wrong the first time. I don't want to do it again the second time. So she has 5 questions. 1, can she take out the whole pasuk? Can she remove the whole pasuk? 2, can she remove just God's name? 3, can she, if she somehow cuts off, this would not be a laser situation, cuts off the flesh that has God's name, could she do that and bring that piece to Geniza, right? As a shul rabbi, I'm not sure if I would love to someone bringing a piece of human flesh to my shemos room, but that's what she wants to know if you can do. 4, can a Jewish doctor do this? And 5, can the rabbi help her with some sort of organization or gemach that could help her pay for this expensive procedure? Those are the 5 questions. Rav Bakshi Daron goes on to say that it sounds like from her question that another rabbi told her the only option for her would be to have someone, a non-Jewish doctor, cut off, surgically remove the part of her ankle with God's name on it, and then bring it to Geniza, bury it, or bring it to Shemos. That would be a very, very painful way to solve this problem, but that's the answer she got from a rabbi she asked, and she turns to Rav Bakshi Daron to see if there's any other way to handle this question. That's the question. Okay. I hope we all understand that question. If it's not clear, please let me know. But essentially, a woman has God's name tattooed on her ankle. She wants to know if she could remove it. And now we know, based on what we've learned, that erasing God's name is problematic. And this is one of the 7 of God's names that you are not allowed to erase. What should she do? So now let's try to understand, first of all, this question of erasing God's name even on flesh, right? Does that even apply to this situation? So we do have a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat that is not necessarily dealing with a tattoo, but is dealing with the name of God that is written on someone's flesh. The Gemara says, we're talking about going into a mikvah, which would lead to the erasure of God's name, which is written on someone's flesh. This could be a Shabbat issue, right? Mechika, the prohibition of erasing on Shabbos. And this could also be an erasing of God's name issue. So the Gemara says, Hare shehaya shem katuv al bsaro. If one had a sacred name of God written on his skin, Hare ze lo yirchotz v'lo yasuch v'lo ya'amod bimkom hatinofet. That person must not wash it in water, nor smear it with oil, nor stand in a dirty place. Can't stand in a dirty place because it's disrespectful to God's name. And you can't wash it off because that would be erasing. So we see the Gemara does address this issue of erasing God's name that's written on someone's flesh. Nizdamna lo tevila shel mitzvah. Now, what about if the person has to go to the mikvah for a mitzvah purpose? Korech aleha gemi v'yored v'tovel. The person should wrap a reed over God's name and then go into the mikvah. Rabbi Yossi Omer le'olam yored v'tovel kedarko ubilvad shelo yishafshef. The person doesn't have to cover it up. They could go in as long as they do not actively rub on the writing, which would be a direct erasure of what's written there, in this case, God's name. So we see the Gemara does address this. There's some leeway with this sort of just going into the water, and if it gets erased by itself, that would be okay. It's indirect, we call it halacha grama. We'll get to that towards the end of the discussion. But the Gemara does touch on that. The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, and I mentioned the source just so we're clear that God's name found anywhere, a dirty place would be like an outhouse, correct. Or anywhere where there would be waste or even garbage or insects and things, insects gathering or rotting food, things like that. So the Rambam teaches here that it's not just on paper or on parchment, but anywhere God's name is, we have to treat it respectfully. He says, Kli sheyashem katuv alav, a vessel that has God's name written on it. You go on a trip to Israel, you buy a washing cup with the bracha of Al Nitilat Yadayim, and instead of the letter Hey, the artist wrote out God's name. And you no longer want the washing cup. You can't throw that washing cup out, right? Because it has God's name. Klishia katuv, shem katuv alav, a vessel that has God's name inscribed upon it. Kotzetz et mekom Hashem v'gonzo. You have to cut off the part of God's name that has it and put it in the geniza. V'yafilu hiya Hashem chakuk b'chli matachot or b'chli zechuchit, even if it's engraved in metal or in glass. V'ticha kli hareze loke, and you melt down the glass or you melt down the metal, you get malkot for that. That's a violation of this prohibition. So it's not just about paper or parchment. Anywhere God's name is, you can't erase it, which Rav Bakshi Daron And Rav Usher Weiss said there's no reason to assume that having it on your flesh would be any different. There's a prohibition. So we can't sort of help this person out of her predicament by saying, well, it doesn't count if it's written on your flesh, because as you see from the Rambam, it doesn't really matter where it's written. Okay, so let's talk about the first sort of glimmer of hope that the poskim give to answer this question that one can, in fact, erase the Lisa, you have wine. Next time you have to bring wine for all of us. Or maybe Rabbi Gelman, this would be a great program that Torah in Motion delivers a bottle of wine to everyone for an extra donation to Torah in Motion. Everyone gets a bottle of wine.
I'll tell you what, I'll meet everyone in Israel and I will provide the wine.
All right, halavai, halavai. We should all get there soon. Okay, so the first glimmer of hope is to ask the question, who wrote the name? What were the circumstances under which the name was written? Does that affect at all the question of whether or not it can be erased? And so the Rambam writes as follows in the Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Torah, Kitvei HaKodesh kulan uperushein uveurehen asur l'sarfan ula'abdan biyad v'amabdan biyad makin oto makat mardot. Holy scriptures or anything else with God's name, we're not allowed to destroy, and if you do, one gets malkot for sort of being a rebellious person. But, says the Rambam, Bamed divarim amurim, under what circumstances does this apply? Kitvei HaKodesh HaKatvan Yisrael b'kedusha. This refers to sacred writings which were written in sacredness by a Jew, meaning the person who wrote them had in mind for them to have sanctity. However, he says, Aval apikoresh Yisrael shekatav sefer Torah, a heretic who wrote a Torah, sarfin oto imas karot sheba. We burned that Torah with God's name in it. Mipnei she'eno ma'amin b'kedushat Hashem. The person who wrote does not believe in the sanctity of God's name. V'lo katvu l'shmo. It was not written for the purpose of God, of that sanctity. Ella, why was it written? Shuma ale b'dato shezeh kishar hadivarim. It was written stam. It was like someone's writing, copying down, Hamlet or Shakespeare. Right? It doesn't have any sanctity. And if it doesn't have a sanctity, it can be burned. So Rav Usher Weiss and Rav Bakshi Daron say, maybe we can apply that in our situation as well. And he's going to say it explicitly, but presumably the person who wrote this tattoo didn't really believe in the Torah and didn't believe in the sanctity of the Torah, because I would think that if they did, they wouldn't be writing tattoos with God's name on people. So even though God's name appears there, it does not seem to contain the sanctity of the letters that it has. That's sort of the first approach that the poskim take. And they use this Gemara in Masechet Gittin to prove their point. It's an interesting case. Titania, Harei sheyat tzarich lichtov et Hashem v'nitkaven lichtov Yehuda. Here's the situation. A sofer is writing a Torah. And the sofer is up to a point where they're supposed to write God's name, the Yud, the Hey, and the Vav, and the Hey. But the sofer loses track and instead thinks that he is going to write the word Yehuda. So as he's writing, he's thinking, I'm writing the word Yehuda. He has no intention to write God's name. And accidentally, he leaves out the Daled. So now he has written God's name, where God's name needs to be, but when he was writing it, he thought he was writing Yehuda. The person had to write God's name. But instead he had in mind to write Yehuda. He made a mistake and left out the Dalet. Rabbi Yehuda says, all you have to do is go over God's name with the kulmus, with the quill. My son's becoming a bar mitzvah at the end of the month, and he got his first fountain pen this week. Baruch Hashem, the old tradition of getting a bar mitzvah boy a fountain pen lives, and he got a fountain pen. Not quite a quill, closest thing we have in our house to a quill. He got a fountain pen. So Rabbi Yehuda says, just go over the Hebrew letters with the quill, and that sanctifies the name. The Chachamim or min. However, the Chachamim say, no, Ein Hashem min hamuvchar. This is not the way to write God's name. This name has no sanctity, because when the person wrote it, his intention was to write Yehuda, not to write Hashem. And no matter how many times you go over this with your quill, it's not going to change the fact that the person wrote it with the other intention. So that's the proof to this Rambam and to Rav Asher Weiss and to Bakshi Daron, suggesting that you may have God's name. You may have the letters of God's name. It may look like God's name. It's in a pasuk, which certainly indicates that it's supposed to be God's name. But since it was written with these ulterior motives, it does not contain sanctity, and the prohibition of erasing it may not apply. That's point number one. And in fact, Rav Asher Weiss, when he was dealing with the question, it was a little different than the question from Rav Bakshi Daron, but he says it explicitly here in this tshuva. Uvenidun didan, in our case, naseh hakakua al yedei goy b'Brazil. This, the situation that he was dealing with was a Jewish person was in Brazil, and they got a tattoo in a tattoo parlor in Brazil, which was presumably operated by a Gentile. Shelo yadav v'lo hikir lo shem shamayim v'lo katav ivri. The person didn't know this was God's name, didn't know Hebrew. How did they write it? Ella asa et hakakua lefi timuna shutzka b'fanav. They simply copied a picture. The person went and said, "I'd like you to make this on my body," and the person copied it. And based on that, says Rav Asher Weiss, maybe it doesn't apply because it doesn't have God's name. It doesn't have the sanctity of God's name because it was not written. It was written by a non-Jew, and it was also written not for God's name. Now, our case of Bakshi Daron, it sounds like the woman got the tattoo in Israel, presumably by a Jewish tattooist or tattoo artist. But again, it lacks the sanctity. And the Rambam, remember we said, even if a Sefer Torah is written by an Apikoros, then it does not have the sanctity. By the way, the Mishnah Brura, in an interesting comment, quotes the Chavot Yair. This is in source number 16. Says as follows, that he is matir latiach hamatbeot shel shem ben dalid shenasim b'medinot shvedim, that one is allowed to melt down coins that have God's four-letter name on them. Not sure if it's the Yud, the Hey, and the Vav, and the Hey, or the Aleph, Daled, Nun, and the Yud. Not clear, but he says you're allowed to melt those down, which would constitute destroying God's name. Why? Once you put currency out in the public, it's clearly not a holy item. It's been given to be used for all sorts of non-holy purposes. And again, that would reflect back on the intention of the engraver, of the minting of those coins, and it does not have the kedusha of God's name, and therefore you could erase it. So those are all sources which fall into point number one. We have to look at the source and the intention of the writer, and that may affect the sanctity of the name and give us some sort of out and allow us to erase a tattoo in such situation. Okay. Now, let's look at point number two. Erasing God's name to save it from disrespect. This is the Minchas Chinuch. The Minchas Chinuch is a commentary written by Yosef Babad on the Sefer HaChinuch. We started with the Sefer HaChinuch. He's talking about the same mitzvah of erasing God's name. And he says something very interesting. He says, let's say you write God's name on a pig. Can you erase it? Right? We saw the Rambam, which seems to say it doesn't matter where it is. But the Sefer HaChinuch raises an interesting question. When we learn in the Gemara, and the poskim tell us that we learn from a pasuk that says, "Leman tiyeh Torat Hashem beficha," that God's name should be in your mouth. That ritual items need to be written only on parchment that comes from a kosher from an animal that you could have eaten, because it says "Leman tiyeh Torat Hashem beficha." that God's word should be in your mouth. So he says, if you write God's name on a behemat tameah, on an unclean, meaning unkosher animal, he says, aval b'chtav al or behema v'chayat tameah the isur yesh b'davar d'chtiv leman tiyeh Torah Hashem b'ficha. You're not allowed to write it on there to begin with, because it doesn't pass the test of being something that's potentially kosher. V'nira the isur yesh b'davar, you're not allowed to write it on that. V'lo pasul bilvad dimashma de Torah hikpida the Torah Hashem nichtav dafka al hamutar. Im yesh bazeh isur mechika im nichtav al or behema v'chayat tameah. He wonders whether or not there's a prohibition of erasing it if it's on a non-kosher animal, because that's not what the Torah was talking about when the Torah was talking about writing God's name. Maybe it would apply the same thing to the human flesh, which we're not allowed to eat. And you could maybe apply that same svara of the Minchas Chinuch. And then, in one of the most interesting sources I found, Rav Weiss talks about this idea of saving God's name from bizayon, from being in a disrespectful place. And a couple of really interesting case studies. Right here in paragraph labeled Aleph, this is source number 19, he raises this interesting question. He talks about a tshuva of the Chatam Sofer. Katav HaChatam Sofer b'shelet tshuva chelet vav siman chet. The Sofer Echad Shekatav Zeh Hashar LaHashem Tzadikim Yavo Vo. Right in front of our shuls, we all have placards, Shivita Hashem L'Eged Tamid, or in this case, Zeh Hashar LaHashem Tzadikim Yavo Vo. Tzadikim Yavo Vo. Almanat L'Kavo B'Shar Beit HaKnesset. The Sofer, the artist who made this, did it to attach to the shul. What happened? I've been a pulpit rabbi for over 23 years. I've never seen anything like this. V'natlu adam echad rasha v'kav'u b'beit hakisei. Some evil person stole the sign that was supposed to be in the front of the shul and put it in the bathroom. Ha'im mutar lim chok shem zeh. So now they want to know if they could erase God's name because it's sitting in the bathroom. V'chidesh ha'chatam sofer lahalacha d'yesh lim chok pasuk zeh al yedei goy. He says the Chatam Sofer has a unique, novel approach. He says you could erase it either by asking a goy katan, a minor Gentile. V'im iyavshar al yedei katan yasu kein al yedei goy gadol. If you can't find a child who's non-Jewish, you should ask a adult Gentile. V'im gamze iyavshar. If you can't do that, yimchekenu o ya'avdenu Yisrael gadol v'lo Yisrael katan. And if you can't find the Gentile, then you should have an adult Jew, not a child. Why not use a kid? Sometimes that's a halachic out for a sticky situation, using a child. It says, one, we don't want this kid to think it's okay to erase God's name. I remember when I was a kid, I did it. I could do it now. Even though we have a prohibition to erase God's name, but in this case, we have to do it to save God's name from being disrespected. Gidola avira lishma. It's really a big chiddush, right? This is a sin for God's name, right? We're sinning here for God's name. That's why we need an adult. Was the proper kavanah. I'm sinning, but I'm doing it with the kavanah, with the intention to save God's name from being desecrated, and a child doesn't have that halachic capacity. So we see here precedent in the Chatam Sofer to erase God's name if it's in a disrespectful place. And then we come to this amazing, amazing story, Stei Chemed number 2 for this class. In source number 20, right here, V'shuv ra'iti et ma shekatav bazeh Stei Chemed. Stei Chemed has a wild situation he records. Shera'at shuva shekatav hagon hatzadik Rav Eliyahu Tzvi Zatzal migdolei Yerushalayim b'svina shenochrim shodedim alav. There was a boat, and some pirates, some non-Jewish pirates took over this boat. V'yesh chashash sheyechalalu sefer Torah shaba. And the Jews who are on this boat are afraid that the non-Jews are going to desecrate the Torah Listen to this. V'hitir lizarko layam. The rabbi permitted them to throw the Torah overboard into the sea, into the ocean. Kedei lahatzilo mibizayon gadol, in order to save it from this type of disrespect. V'od de'ein kan ela gram mechika, getting back to gram mechika, throwing a Torah into the ocean is not, the words will not immediately and instantly erase. It'll take some time for them to degrade. V'lo mechicha gemura, it's not real direct erasure, al ayin sham. That's a really fascinating story. We don't know, even in the situation, this is like a vadai and a suffix. We weren't sure if the Gentile was going to desecrate the Torah, but nonetheless, he permits him to throw the Torah overboard, which certainly is going to lead to its destruction. So it's really fascinating. But again, two interesting cases where poskim allowed us to erase God's name in order to save God's name from being in a disrespectful place, and says both Rav Bakshi Daron and Rav Weiss that maybe that could apply here too. God's name is on this woman's ankle. It doesn't belong there. It only belongs in a Torah or a Sefer Kodesh or a holy book. It doesn't belong on a human body. And that's disrespectful. I don't think it matters where it is on her body. It's just disrespectful anywhere. And so perhaps that would be another reason to allow it. That's number two. Number one was we want to talk about the origins and the intention of the writer. Number two was perhaps we're allowed to save God's name from being disrespected. And number three, we come to grama, that the erasing God's name with the laser surgery is not instantaneous. I didn't know that this is the way laser worked, but at least according to the internet, not just the internet, but I did some research on this. Apparently, if we ever have something like dirt under our skin or something that's under our skin, our natural body processes will lead to that foreign entity to disintegrate and disappear. But apparently, tattoo pigments are too big to be removed by the natural processes that our bodies go through. So in order for them to get erased, a laser is applied to them. The laser breaks up the larger particles into smaller particles. And over time, our body's natural processes overtake those smaller particles, and the tattoo is gone. So when someone lasers a tattoo, apparently it doesn't disappear right away. It's not like a magic sponge when your kid writes on the wall, right? It's not automatic. It's indirect and takes time. That's what we call grama in halakha. Grama is a fascinating halachic tool or device. And based on this, Rav Asher Weiss says this explicitly. Ulevaer dezeh sarich ani lahasbir et oven asiyat kakua v'hasarato kasher osim ketov kakua machdirim tzvaim shonim l'shichva ta'or hakuruyat dermis. He explains to us how a tattoo is made, and then he explains to us how it's removed. Energit halaser nivlaim b'ta'im ele v'gormim lehitparkut hata'im v'shichror hatzeva shu kalua b'tei v'shlav zeh adayin eina kakua nimchak אלא מאחר שהצבע משתחרר מתוך התה, מתחיל תהליך הקרוי phagocytosis. Again, a slow process where the body takes over and removes the tattoo. And he says that's grama. Here in the first paragraph, Venira o de bemet ein hasarata kakua ela grama v'lo maseh biyadayim. This is not direct erasing. This is indirect. This is what we call grama. And if you remember, what's the proof that grama is okay? We go back to the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, where we talk with a person who wanted to go to the mikveh, but they had God's name written on their body. What was the conclusion of the Gemara? The conclusion of the Gemara was, the person can go. Why? As long as they do not, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find this here. As long as they do not, ubilvad shelo yishaf sheif. As long as they do not rub it. But going into the mikveh with God's name on your skin is certainly going to start the process of the name being erased, but it's okay according to the Gemara because it's indirect. It's grama. Therefore it's mutar, and that is what Rav Asher Weiss says explicitly right here. V'nira o demet ein hasara hakakua el grama v'lo maseh b'yadayim. Gram mechika mutar kimuvar b'Shabbat. It's allowed gram mechika as we saw on Shabbat. V'after pashut, even though we shouldn't engage in the indirect erasing of God's name for no reason, here, because we have reasons. One, it's disrespectful. Two, it was probably written in a situation where it's not really sanctified, we would allow it. And both he and Rabbi Daron allow for this woman, in both cases, to have the tattoo erased using laser surgery. Before I open up to any comments or questions, I want to just pose an interesting question raised in a tshuva by Rav Zilberstein in the Chashukei Chemin. Anyone who's doing Daf Yomi, as I know Rabbi Gelman does, this is a great Daf Yomi tool. It's questions and answers from each. Rabbi Gelman, you know this sefer? Questions and answers. He has a volume on every Masechet of Shas, I think, and more than one question on every daf. It's amazing. I'm maybe on every Masechet, but almost every Masechet. And he is Rav Elyashiv's son-in-law, and he has amazing questions. I'm not sure if they're real or not, but even if he makes them up, based on every page, more than one, sometimes 3 or 4 questions, where the answer to the question is based on that daf. It's a great way to learn more deeper in the daf. So here, in the whole discussion about tattoos and mechika, he raises an interesting question, machloket, between the Sefer HaChinuch and a Torontonian, right? The Yisodei Yeshurun, the author was from Toronto, yeah?
Yeah.
Right. So the Minchas Chinuch says it's not proper. The question is essentially this. What's the prohibition of a tattoo? Is the prohibition getting a tattoo? This is a little longest. Is the prohibition getting a tattoo or having a tattoo? Meaning, I get a tattoo. Am I now sinning every single day, every single minute or second that I have the tattoo? Or was the sin only once I got the tattoo? That was a sin? Okay, now I have a tattoo. There's no issur to have a tattoo. There's an issur to get a tattoo. That's the lumdus question here. But the Chashukei Chemin quotes the Minchas Chinuch. He said, "She'ein nachon liYisrael sheyeh ketovet kakal b'saro." It's not quite strong halachic language. He says it's not proper for a Jew to have a tattoo on their skin. However, the Yisodei Yeshurun, Rav Felder, right? He says, "Upele shelo matzinu de'over al isur kol zman shekatuvet kaka alav." It's amazing, he says. We don't find anywhere written that every single moment we live with a tattoo, that we are sinning. And that's a question of whether you erase it on Shabbos or not. It's a more technical question, but that's his point. That's a sort of a side point, interesting question, meaning, does this woman even have an obligation to remove the tattoo with God's name? Let's say it doesn't have God's name. Does someone have an obligation to remove a tattoo? It doesn't sound like it. It's like not something people may not want to show, and you can get rid of it, but there may not be an obligation to get rid of it. The prohibition may have been getting the tattoo to begin with. In any case, to conclude, we saw a 3-pronged approach. One, we want to factor in the origins of the tattoo and the tattoo artist. 2, we want to talk about saving God's name from being in a disrespectful place. And 3, we want to factor in the notion that this is indirect erasure. Grama happens over time by the natural body processes. It's only sort of, it's the catalyst of it is the laser treatment. And in both cases, both Rav Daron and Rav Asher Weiss permit the removal of God's name with a laser treatment. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I know we have an hour. I was asked to leave some time for questions, so I'm happy to do that. I see some questions in the chat. Is there an issue of Marat Ayin if someone sees you destroy a Sefer Torah written by someone we decide shouldn't? That's a great question. You could argue that yes, maybe you should destroy it, or at least make an announcement, right? I'm burning this Sefer Torah that was written by a heretic, and that's why we're burning it. Yeah, that's a good question. Any other?
Rabbi, of course, it has to tie in. Of course, today we don't really have too many apikorsim. I mean, that's a real modern question. That becomes very complex.
Right, that's true. That's a very good point. I do not recommend burning a Sefer Torah written by any Jew.
Right.
Absolutely. Back in the day, the Rambam was a little more zealous about those things, although he gave us a lot of leeway too in terms of Tinok Shenishba and things like that. But that's correct. And there's a famous article I think Rabbi Riskin wrote in Tradition about whether or not there's such a thing as a heretic today.